Sheila, I just hit record. Everybody should have gotten a notification, and I'm just going to hand it off to you guys to get us started. Okay, I'm going to mute myself. I'm here if you need me.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our speaker series that is on the future of RBQM and customized key risk indicator libraries, how small companies can take big steps to reduce risk and provide proper trial oversight. My name is Sheila Gwizdak, and I am one of the practice leads here at Halloran Consulting Group. And today's discussion will actually be led by our organization and quality solutions team here at Halloran. And we'll get to all of their introductions in just a minute. I just want to share that this is a topic that my team and I are really passionate about. We talk a lot about it. Maybe we're a little strange that way, but we think a lot about it. We talk a lot about it. And we really see it as a positive development, not only for the future of industry, but the future of key risk indicators and risk-based quality management as a whole. Before we get started, I actually have a few housekeeping notes to share in order to keep the conversation running smoothly over the next hour. For those of you attending, please keep yourself on mute. However, we would love to see your lovely faces. We look at ourselves quite a bit, so we love to see other people join. So please feel free to turn your cameras on. If you have a question or a comment, please put it into the chat feature, and our moderator will actually get those questions throughout our conversation so that we either can answer them during the conversation or at the very end of the presentation. For those of you that might be joining our speaker series for the first time, Halloran is a life science consulting firm. We provide deep domain experience in the areas of development strategy and program leadership, regulatory, quality, and clinical, while also providing organizational solutions and technology enablement to advance these functions to the next level of growth or change. At Halloran, we're always looking for ways to share our insights with our life science community. So we started our speaker series a few years ago to have our own internal experts share their knowledge on hot topics and emerging trends to our network of life science companies. Joining us today for this talk, I'm really happy to have Rod Rahimi, Liz Bodie, John Sikora, Lynn Agostinelli, and Karen Travers. And Rod is going to be our moderator. So take it from here, Rod.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining, depending on where you are. Good afternoon, good morning. So my name is Rod Rahimi. I'm a consultant here at Halloran, and I like to consider myself a bit of an RBQM nerd. I'm sure everyone on this panel will say the same thing. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. So Lynn, please, or Liz, please get us started.
Lynn, take it away. I'm Lynn Agostinelli. I'm a principal consultant with the Clinical Operations Group here at Halloran. I focus on working with small clients or large clients in the clinical operations sphere, filling in often for roles. But I also work very closely with the Organ Quality Solutions Group on bringing the clinical perspective to what's going on with quality. Liz?
Excellent. And I'm a principal. Hi, I'm Liz Bodie. I'm a principal consultant here within the Organizational and Quality Solutions Group. And I do the flip of what Lynn does. I partner with clinical operations in executing organizational solutions for companies, be it an org assessment or solving a problem, and also wear a quality hat in helping organizations operationalize, if you will, the regulations with a practical setting in a clinical trial or study specific manner. So excited to talk about RBQM. It's definitely one of my passions, and turn it over to John.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Sikora. I'm an associate principal consultant in organizational and quality solutions, focusing in on organizational design and transformations, partnering up with our other practice areas such as Lynn and clinical, regulatory, and quality to assess organizations, their capabilities, and to design and help them transform their capabilities, both from a procedural individual level down and across, kind of making sure that that change gets embedded into their organizations. Quality risk-based management is definitely an area that continues to evolve, and that requires both an understanding of capabilities for individuals, organizations, and really making sure that that sticks as organizations take on the responsibilities. Karen?
Yeah, and I'll wrap things up. I'm Karen Travers, like everyone else, or well, except for Lynn, I'm in the Organizational and Quality Solutions group, but my focus is on technology, and I really work with all the different practices and looking for how systems and data can support, different processes, different needs, help provide organizational efficiencies, compliance. With RBQM, we're very focused on making sure we have the data to identify risks, manage risks, and provide that operational support. Back to you, Rod.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm really looking forward to talking about the future of RBQM today and how to build customized KRI libraries and what that process looks like. And I think there's a lot of insights and trends that can be extracted from clinical data. So our conversation will largely focus on how to get the right data to make the right KRI decisions to monitor and reduce your risk for clinical trials, regardless of the size of your organization. But before we get started, a couple reminders. Number one, feel free to ask questions on the chat feature. I will be monitoring it. We will be monitoring it throughout the discussion, and we'll save some time towards the end to have a more open-ended dialogue and conversation. And before we get started, we'd actually like to ask you some poll questions. So thank you, Maria, for launching the poll questions.
And there are 4 questions, so please make sure that you scroll down to answer all 4 of them.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to take the time to answer it myself as well. I'm really curious to see which function people are coming from, if this is a topic of interest for them.
We're still getting results, Rod, so just give it maybe 30 more seconds and then I'll share where we are. It's a really great way to see where our audience is as we are diving into the discussion today. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and launch results, Rod, so you can take it from here. There we go.
Thank you so much. Wow. So most of our audience, 42%, comes from clinical, and then the second largest is quality, which is no surprise to me. And I'm sure it's no surprise to any of the panelists. Our second question, do you have an RBQM KRI strategy in place? And most people say no, they do not. Okay, well, you've come to the right place. Do you have experience setting up KRIs and monitoring KRIs? This is split with yes and no. So curious to hear more about that through the discussion and questions. Can you get the right data when you need it to support your RBQM decisions? This one's a hot topic, and most people say that they don't know. Which is, I'd love to hear more about that from your perspective, Karen, later on in the discussion. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So question number one, we'd like to kind of set up the foundation of our discussion with some definitions. So simply, number one, what is RBQM? Number two, what are risks as they are related to RBQM? And three, what are KRIs? So first question, what is RBQM? John, please take us away.
Thank you, Rod. We're all involved in clinical research, and as we look at it, we all manage risks. And risk-based quality management, or RBQM, is a process for identifying, prioritizing, and mitigating those important clinical risks that are related to patient safety, data integrity, key endpoints. The process for managing risks involves roughly 7 steps. And step 1 is determining the study data and processes that are critical to ensure that subject safety, reliability, and results. It starts with understanding what's in your protocol, identifying those key risks, to critical data and processes. Next step is evaluating the likelihood, the probability of that risk occurring, as well as the detectability, the ability to detect whether that risk has occurred, and then the risk impact, the effect of the risk on the quality of your clinical trial, the impact on patient safety or your clinical data. Determining if risks are acceptable or if they must be reduced based on additional insights or limits that you place on those risks. Step 5 is then documenting and reporting the risks throughout the conduct of the trial, reviewing your control measures periodically. The important step here is that this isn't a one and done deal with identifying your risks at the beginning of your study, but rather it needs to be part of your plan going forward and having that reviewed and incorporating anything that needs that gets identified as a new risk into your process. So as a way of looking at this, one of the key things that we're going to talk about next is defining kind of key risks or risk indicators. Lynn, do you want to help us define what a risk is?
Sure. Next slide, Maria. So a risk is any factor that might result in your study not doing well and it being compromised. So you can think of a risk at a system level, a clinical trial level, across levels, and it can be a lot of different categories. So think about it as it's something wrong with my study design. I could have something there. Is it the way I'm collecting the data? Is it something in medical I need to look at, or investigational product? And each time you look at a risk, you have to evaluate it, as John was mentioning, is, how likely is it to occur? Is it going to occur? If it's not going to really occur very often, a lot of times you'll give it a lower score and maybe you can disregard it. The impact, and this is an important one. So, if it's going to have a big impact on your study, probably more likely that you should look at that risk more closely versus if it has a lower impact, again, you might not have to keep as close track on it. And detectability. We might want to really look at a risk, but it's something that we just can't get our hands on. And maybe Karen could help us in the long run with that. But maybe it's just something that's really hard for us to detect. And in that case, again, as much as we want to look at that risk, it may just not be the best one for us to focus on. And if we had all the time in the world, we could look at everything. But this is about, what are the most important ones so that my study can come out, because we can't do it all. We're in clinical research and we know that. So it's important to look at the likelihood, the impact, and the detectability as we work through our risks. And then we'll get a score and look at our key risks from there. And I think we're going to Liz next to help
Thanks,
us.
Lynn. Next slide. So when we think about the definition that we heard from John earlier, one of the elements of risk is risk control. So this means, what are the ways that we can control and ideally prevent risk up front in our studies? So these control measures should be in our protocols, in our study plans, and all functions have a key role in identifying and controlling risk and having input in that process. So when we think about control strategies, if you will, ways to mitigate risks, One of the ways is by identifying our critical quality elements. And with the modernization of ICH-E8, we're going to see new terms, CTQ, critical to quality factors. Those should be defined early on in the study design stage, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we also have the KRIs, right? So these are the key risk indicators to help us detect, report, and hopefully mitigate the risk before they become issues. Remember that risks are something that might happen, and issues are things that are currently happening. So we don't want them to occur. So we want to prevent them, if you will. So the main goal of KRIs are to identify the problems before they become critical issues on your study, on your program, at your company. Back to you, Rod.
Thank you so much. And Liz, I actually want to stay with you for just a second. Now that we've defined what KRIs are, we want to keep KRIs simple so that we're grounded. Would you be able to walk us through some examples?
Absolutely. So yes, you're right, Rod. Simplicity is key. So some easy ways perhaps to start thinking about KRIs can include things that we know about on how we conduct our clinical trials. So if we step back and look at sort of the things we already know, here are a few maybe examples to get us started. We know we need some kind of investigational product. So what do we put in our clinical monitoring plans? Again, those functional plans are key to focus on investigational product. Maybe your study is set up such that your IP has a way to timely report on temperature excursions to be able to access that information to assess whether it impacts the stability of your investigational medicinal product or even your drug product are key and important KRIs to be able to measure. Or if maybe you use a randomization IRT system and maybe subjects are randomized in your study and one of the subjects is misrandomized, how do we monitor that? Maybe by looking at our enrollment rates and establishing some KRIs around that. So looking at your investigational product maybe is one way to sort of dive in and look at KRIs. Another one would be data quality. So looking for abnormal trends in your data, such as lack of variability or CRF completion markers, or your sites aren't adhering to data entry instructions, et cetera, et cetera. So it might be a KRI around timely recording of data in your EDC system, or looking at the query rates and assessing if a given site is an outlier. Or it might be looking at protocol deviations and the timely reporting through either EDC or the CTMS or monitoring visit reports, to name a few ways to capture that information. And lastly, we'll talk about safety. We know that that's key to our studies. We want to make sure our product is effective and our product is safe. So we know that SUSARs, or suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions, are important. We know that AEs and SAEs are important. So what is the compliance with the reporting of SAEs and SUSARs? And not only for us getting them as sponsors of a clinical trial, but also for communicating them to health authorities and ethics committees. So can we measure compliance to those reporting timeframes? Managing issues, essential documents, study subject enrollment, staffing, turnover, workload. Those are all other ideas off the top of my head that could get you started when you're starting to define your KRIs. Back to you, Rod.
Thank you, Liz. Really appreciate that. And I think one of the reasons why so many people are on this call right now and why we're talking about this subject is because the industry is familiar with, or at least heard of, ICH's E6R3, the third revision that will be released this year. And the revision will focus on greater efficiency and a focus on quality in trials. So I want to ask the panel, how does the draft of ICH GCP E6R3 affects how we go about KRIs? Liz, do you want to take a first stab?
Certainly. So we know from ICH E6R2 that we're required to have monitoring plans. We should have a risk-based approach, including KRIs, that we can appropriately manage risk in our studies. So we also may have a risk management plan and for how you will prevent and mitigate risks and prevent those unlikely sources of error in the conduct of your study, the collection of your study data, be it efficacy endpoints, et cetera. And all of this is focused towards the eye on protecting the subjects and security and the integrity of your trial. And of course, I hope that by now we all have a standard process for that as well. Additionally, I think as we look at the industry and the guidances and regulations around that, the FDA has updated their compliance program guidance manual back in 2021. And guess what? Regulators are also checking for that. So they're looking to see if the sponsors have risk management plans, including the KRIs. So those written procedures around what your company does around that is definitely a phase or a wave that we're moving towards. So you may wonder what goes into an RMP, a risk management plan. So when designing your study, again, from the very beginning, the team should start thinking about what are those risks, how will they be evaluated, how will they be mitigated? And maybe you organize your RMP in phases, study startup and the initiation of your trial. What are the risks around that? During the conduct of your study, the risks sort of evolve, and then maybe near the closeout. So it's a living document and it has to be updated on a regular basis. And I saw in the chat a question about frequency. You know, I would say, look at your own company process. I mean, we recommend regularly. So what does that mean for your company? It should be done anytime there is a risk, but at least quarterly is what I would recommend. Liz Bodie's opinion.
Totally, Liz. Totally agree with that. And I think that's also a good segue to our next question about overdoing versus underdoing this and KRIs. We've seen a lot of cases of overdoing versus underdoing. So I'd like the panel to share their insight. Would you please take a moment to share why this spectrum also matters? So Lynn, I'll ask you to take a first stab.
Sure. I think we need to remember why we are looking at the risks. We're never going to get to perfection. So I think it's a matter of getting enough risks that we can have the oversight and quickly identify that those risks are occurring, and if any mitigation that we need to take on happens quickly. And I think every company is going to be different in the way they can do that. You need to have enough KRIs that you can oversee what's critical to your study. And I think that goes again, to what we're talking about with E8, what are the critical to quality factors. And, if you have too many that you're looking at, it's going to become an exercise of slogging through them all and not really thinking about them. So get it down to a number that you can look at when you need to. And I agree with Liz, quarterly is great, but some maybe you need to do more often, depending on the length of your study, when that risk is most likely to occur. So think about those. And then when you're really doing, do it with an intent of, what is happening? What can I do with it? And you may get bigger, as you add another staff member on or two, maybe you can do more. But, for a small company, I always say, like maybe 4 to 6, really key ones is a good place to start, and then add on as you can. And you can start with the library and tweak as you go on from there. So I would say that's where to start with, Ron.
Thank you, Lynn. And John, would you be able to add a little bit more insight from your end?
Sure. I think one of the key things to be able to get at that right level of managing risk is really to start with the beginning in mind. And part of as we look at how we are progressing, both from a regulatory and ICH recommendation, it's really starting with the protocol and starting with quality by design. So as you're looking at your protocol, identifying those areas that where there may be important errors or where there's a risk to subject safety or to the data, that starts to really build out the things that you should be focusing in on. And that may change also as you start to, early on in your development program and your phase 1, phase 2 trials, and continues to evolve and build out as you move into your phase 3. So I think one of the key important things here is going to be is to have that library become something that is not a static and check the box activity, but rather it is focusing in on, all right, what have we learned up to today? How does that now influence our risks that we've had before? And then what's different as we go forward?
Thank you so much, John. And Liz, I'll ask you to add your input. And if you can, a question from the chat comes and says, can you give an example of overdoing, an example of what is worth reviewing more frequently? So if you have any insight on that, please take a stab.
Absolutely. So we must be active in the prevention of risk. So we know that. We've talked about that already, right? So with the modernization of ICH E8R1, which by the way, EMA and FDA have both provided guidelines around. And we know we have to think about study design as upfront. So identifying those key or critical data and critical processes up front will allow you to sort of have a foundation and a good place to start. If you're maybe early on in your development stage, maybe like Lynn said earlier, 4 to 6 is a good number to start from. As you get more informed about your therapeutic area, the reactions that we're seeing, the challenges and processes, the things that we're learning about our data, we can start to adapt and review our KRIs on a regular basis. But again, to support the meaningfulness and the reliability of your data and to protect subjects should be areas that will allow us to maybe not overdo it and get so bogged down in a specific level where we don't know yet if the product is safe. So early on, simple, focus on critical data and critical processes for your given study.
Thank you so much, Liz. I want to move on to the next question, the next topic here, which is their value and not just defining owners, but looking at KRIs as a cross-functional process. And Lynn, I'd love you to go ahead and answer this topic.
Yeah, coming from a clinical ops perspective, I always feel like sometimes it falls to us and everyone else might disagree, but you know, I feel like a lot of times we're the one driving the process and, you know, going in and doing it. And I'm not saying other people are slackers, but I think because we're often the authors of so many plans, we are used to doing that. So I think you need to pull other people in, not just in identifying the risks. You know, it's a good time to kind of sit down and say, okay, let's talk through this together. And I think, you know, an example of having multiple owners, I worked on a study and we needed to, it was a decentralized study, we needed to have samples shipped back from a subject from their home to a vendor to be evaluated in a lab within 72 hours. And so the CRO's project manager was actually the owner, but when you actually looked at the risks, there were multiple other owners because it started with the person from the lab that had to, you know that was coming and tell us, no, it didn't come or it didn't come. We had to go to the person that was involved in getting it shipped. We had to go to the CRA who was the intermediary between those two people. So all those people held a little part of that risk and we all had to work together in identifying it and then working through that. So that's when you can see, you know, it's just not falling on one person. It has to be a group discussion and a group identification and then work through. So there's one example. And I think I can answer the one question in the chat about, you know, we're talking about, oh, we only review these on a quarterly basis, but we're always kind of looking at the risks. And when we talk about quarterly basis, it's when you sit down and look at it kind of in aggregate of what's really happening. As in day-to-day activities, we're also always going to get that data coming across that we see something pop up and we'll react to it. You know, the reviews that we're talking about is when we're kind of looking at everything we can pull together to really identify some of the outer trends as well. I hope that answers that as well.
Thank you so much for that example, Lynn, and thank you for answering that question. I'm going to stay with you for another question. So we have a broad audience, and some of our audience come from smaller companies, and those smaller companies may be wondering, if you don't have enough data to inform decisions on KRIs, where do you start? So I'm wondering, how do you get the right data to measure KRIs?
So I'm not the data person, but I'll talk to how coming up with the KRIs and then working with the various people to get that. So I really think, it's starting when we're talking about starting at protocol design, sitting down with everyone and talking through. And if you don't, have a lot, you're a newer company, you have a small group, you haven't done this before, really just talk about what my study is, what's my primary endpoint, what if I don't get is gonna sink me, and really walk through there. I gave that example before of the lab data. I've also seen it happen like with investigational product that Liz was talking through. So really talk through what's critical to that. The overdoing it comes in when you're, making a risk about a questionnaire that's an exploratory endpoint that, okay, great to have, but I don't need it. So I always think want and need, and if it's a need for my study, I'm going to probably focus on more than a want for my study, which sometimes those exploratory endpoints could be a little more defined as. Use your past experience. We've all been doing this for a long time, or I know I have, and think about like, okay, what has happened in the past that, could translate to this study. And a lot of times you have to think through the specifics of your study. I worked on a study that it was an IV infusion. We all thought, well, the site's given the IV infusion, shouldn't be a problem. And then all of a sudden we realized that the surgeons were saying, well, stop the IV infusion now, I want to operate. And we were getting all these protocol deviations. We never anticipated that. So now every time there's an IV infusion, my first question is, is it going to go long enough? Is it, is this going to be interfered with? Is it going to cause a problem? So always think about your past experience, and that will help you to define those. And, in terms of the data, talk to your vendors. What information can you give me? And sometimes we define KRIs and we want it to look a certain way, and we can't get that data. So we may have to tweak it a little bit, so say, well, I can't get it this way. I can kind of look at it still another way, and, work with what data you can have coming through.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And I wanna ask this same question to Karen, since she is our data expert here. For those smaller companies, how do you get the right data to measure KRIs, Karen?
I think, I'll kind of piggyback onto what both Lynn and Liz said about planning from the beginning, but I think part of identifying your risks is how you're going to measure them and look at the data that you need. And I think as you're working with most small companies, I'm going to assume are outsourcing most things. So you're going to have to get the data from someone else. Make sure you've identified, Lynn gave a great example of the infusion that had to go back in 72 hours, right? That's probably something you don't want to wait 2 months to find out it's not working. So what's the best way to find out that it is or is not going how you expected, right? Could you get a download from the lab? Could you, is there something the patient fills out? So I think, to me, the most important part is, one, identifying how you're going to measure the risk and understanding the variables or the data that you need to do that measurement, and making sure that you can get it somehow, even if it's through a CRO, right? Making sure you can get it in a way that you can consume it well.
Thank you so much.
What you were looking for, Rod?
Yes. You, as always, exceeded my expectations. So I do want to stay with you for another question, Karen. So if smaller companies are working with CROs, and those CROs are providing the KRIs, how do sponsors make sure that the CRO is giving them the right data? What kind of oversight should they build?
Well, I think it's almost very much like the answer I just gave, right? As part of your planning with the CRO, as you're identifying the risks, I think it's important to take control of that process. And, as you're getting things set up with them, making sure that either they can provide the actual answers that you need, or they can provide you the data that you need to look at it. And I think that that should be part of your very early planning with the CRO. You don't want to wait till, you know, halfway through your study to realize you really can't get the answers you need. The other thing I would say to that is the data ecosystem, right? The number of companies and sources of data you have in any given trial now is expanding exponentially. So take some time, you know, if you've only got, you know, in the vicinity of 6-ish or 8-ish risks, you know, I think that's the number we were throwing around early. Think through, you know, not only the risks, how you're going to calculate it, but what's the best source of that data? Where can you get it the earliest and the most accurately, right? I think a lot of times there's an inclination to go to like a CRO CTMS, but it can take sometimes a few weeks for them to get data uploaded into those, where it might make more sense. You know, Liz gave the example of investigational product. Maybe it makes more sense to go to the IRT vendor and get that data. Or maybe it makes more sense to go to, you know, the lab and the example Lynn gave. So I think really thinking through the data you need and the best source of that data, and do it up front so you can get it worked into agreements and contracts and whatever you need.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I also want to ask a clarifying question to the panel. A question I see here on the chat is to differentiate and clarify the terms and the differences between KRIs and QTLs, quality tolerance limits. Who would like to take an initial pass at that?
I can jump in.
When you
So,
want to start, I was on mute, sorry.
okay, you can go, Liz.
I was just going to say you start, I'll finish, but that's fine.
Okay.
So go ahead, talk about KRIs and I can talk about QTLs.
Right.
How's
So the risk is, you know, what can go wrong? I can just jump into the other part, Liz. The quality tolerance limit is how wrong it can go before you need to intervene, right? So, you know, say something you can live with a 10%, you know, we say it's not going to be perfect, right? Nothing's ever going to be perfect. So if we can live with a 10% variance, then, you know, that's our limit, versus we can't, you know, if it's a 50% variance, it's hit our threshold. So one is a threshold that you're going to hit when it's going to become really an issue. And the other one is just like what the risk is. I hope that was basic enough. And Liz, you probably would have been more eloquent in your explanation.
No, you're absolutely right. The KRI is the event, if you will, that you are going to measure against. And once it hits that threshold, that limit, that's the QTL. Yeah, exactly. Good.
Can the panelist offer his input as well, or the moderator on QTL versus KRIs? I like to think of QTLs as study level parameters and KRIs as site level parameters. And then another thing that's been helpful for me to kind of find the differences between KRIs and QTLs is that KRIs are almost KPIs, but KPIs are measures after the study is over. We kind of measure how well we did. KRIs are measured throughout the study. So that's my little tidbit of information. But we can move on to the next question, which is, Karen, from your perspective, how does the data need to be presented to sponsor companies when they're working with a CRO? And then we have a question in the chat from a CRO that we'll get to in just a second.
So I think that's really for the sponsor and the CRO to work out, right? They have to decide as part of the planning stages exactly how you want that data presented, you know, how you want it sent, how you want it, you know, any specific calculations that you want done. And that kind of goes to my earlier point about really defining the risk and how you'll determine it, right? How you'll calculate it, how you'll measure it, you know, things like that. And I think, you know, and I see the question in the chat, and I think that goes really to that point. I think, you know, a lot of companies really put a lot on the CROs, and my recommendation from the data point, and I think, Liz and Lynn can jump in from the quality and clinical side. Even if you're outsourcing things to the CRO, you still have to own it and manage it and work with them to really take ownership of this process, right? Whether it's data, whether it's determining your KRIs. So I think that's really, the partnership that you need, and that's part of it, deciding on the presentation and the delivery. So Lynn, Liz, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
The only thing I would add on is, start the conversation early in your journey with the CRO. So it's a conversation topic that may not get to kickoff meeting, but shortly thereafter, it definitely would be one of the first things I would start discussing.
And I think to put it in reverse, I think this question is coming from a CRO. So they're saying,
Yeah.
it always falls on us. And I think it, sometimes falls on the CRO because the sponsor may be early and, relying on you for your expertise. And but I still think it goes to communication of saying like, hey, a lot of times they've already designed the protocol. So maybe just saying back to them, like, tell me how you designed the protocol, so that you limited risks, or I'm seeing this in here, let's talk it through. And it's going to be, educating them on it and, helping them understand that, it's not just you as the CRO, but it is, them as a sponsor that is, need to work as a team to this. I think some sponsor companies, because they don't know how to do it, will hand it completely over. And even if they want to hand it completely over, there's still stuff within a sponsor that you're responsible for. You're responsible for vendor oversight. So you can never hand over vendor oversight because you need to oversee the CRO. So I think, it's just a matter of education and really just having them sit down with you and really talk it through, like, what have they done? How did they design their study? If it's, past that point and working it through.
Lynn, I'd like to add on. There's a huge component in terms of as companies are growing from kind of their phase 1 to phase 2 stage and maturing into phase 3 organizations. It's really making sure that their QMS, which is going to be a function of how they manage quality, allows for them to now take on additional roles and responsibilities. So going forward, so I think one of the areas that we see as we work with clients who are growing their capabilities, it's also introducing and the change for how they manage quality and risks and everything else. So it really does start with kind of the foundation in their QMS and then builds on the components of quality by design and risk monitoring and everything else, so that if they're doing it, they understand how they're doing it themselves and then how they're and what they're delegating to a CRO. And I think that's an opportunity to really start to shift maybe the responsibility back to the sponsors, as Lynn was suggesting.
Thank you all so much. And the panelists really read my mind, because my next question is kind of already answered, but who ultimately owns the KRI process, and what is your perspective on observations so far from what you've experienced? You've already touched on this, but if there's anything else you'd like to say, Lynn, Karen, Liz, John, please take a stab.
Well, I think it would not be technology that owns it. How's that?
Any thoughts?
Absolutely. We have to think about how we define ownership, right, of the KRI process. Really, it's from a clinical trial management perspective, traditionally the task, if you will, falls on the clinical project manager. But as we evolve our thinking and mature, not only our thinking, mature our industry, and modernize GCP, we really need to think about things from the very beginning. And now with ICH E8 R1 coming out, we, in a sense, have to start doing it from study design. So the clinical project manager may not be involved right away in that study design. So everybody's going to continue to own a piece in that. That has not changed. It's just historically it's falling to the clinical project managers. But everybody really has a piece in it. There's no one size fits all for the process. So we need to continue to evolve that. But there are pieces from the data manager side that are responsible for a lot of this. But they're not necessarily the owners. They just happen to be the repository, to Kara's point, where the information live, right? So it's an important conversation to have up front, define ownership at what stage. I would add on to that.
I think the other component of this is involving the rest of the functions in your organization in contributing to the definition of those KRIs and the QTLs. Because I think as you look at it, as you look at risk, it needs to be looked at from a cross-functional perspective so that whatever you're going to be putting in place and managing it, it's understood at that organizational level for that project, for that program as well.
Thank you so much, all. And I want to be mindful of time. I want to save 10 minutes for an open dialogue. So I'm just going to move to the last question, which is posed to our very own Sheila. Is the future of customized risk management, is there a future in customized risk management, or are there any additional components to consider? So Sheila, please, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, panel. I think there's not only a future, I think that is the future, is customized risk management. I think we've been on this for those of you that have been in industry a really long time, like myself, you've seen we've kind of traveled along this quality risk management journey for quite some time, actually starting with Q9, quality risk management, which is somewhat probably not as common for those of you in the GCP space, but that was really the preamble to all the conversations that we have today, and it's actually under revision again. But that was really instrumental in introducing that quality risk management approach, not only to industry, but also to the regulators who have now picked up that baton. We saw those principles reflected in the revision of E6R2. And now we see with the GCP renovation, actually you see those principles, they're weaved into everything, not only E6R3, but as Liz just mentioned, E8R1 that is just coming out too. And we know that risks are at many levels, but particularly as we're talking at the study level, it has to be customized because it's particular, those things that are key to quality during that study or at that study level. So to answer your question, Rod, I think it's the future of risk management is that it is customized. So it really falls on all of us as professionals to really kind of understand the concepts so that we're able to identify what the risks are to our clinical studies.
I totally agree, Sheila. And I think the foundational aspect of understanding RBQM and how to manage risks is so vital to this process. I want to, before opening up to questions from the audience, I want to thank the panelists and everyone supporting this series for making this happen. So huge thank you all from my side. Audience, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or put it in the chat. Don't be shy. I promise we're not scary.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. So I am on the sponsor side. And so speaking from the sponsor side, I saw someone's comment in here about from the CRO side and the sponsors not taking control. So we have a study where we are having a CRO do the whole RBQM risk assessment piece with us, obviously, but using their processes. And it is the first, let's say it's the first study that we're doing where we're really going through this whole assessment process. We've never done it ourselves internally. So the balance between, hey, it's the first time, do we need to go like gung-ho whole hog on this, or is there some sort of starting point that we should have thought about? Because I feel like we went full force and maybe we should have said, okay, we need to take a step back
but the CRO is driving it, and they were kind of pushing, I say pushing, but they were wanting to use what their full process was. And it's incredibly overwhelming. So there.
I can start with this one. I think this is a little bit what I was talking about before on, having too many, so you can't even, look through them all, when you're, spending 2 hours just to run through your list on did this risk happen or that. So I think it's, a really having that conversation of, okay, maybe you have to kind of up your level of, we're not going to look at anything that's, say the scale is 1 to 10, we're only going to look at 7 to 10, or maybe we're only going to look at, ones that come out as 8 to 10, and really cut it back. So I think it's a matter of, you probably starting with a template, which is great because it makes you think of all those. But I think it's that conscious decision to say, okay, I'm willing to not look at that so that we can concentrate more on something else. So, it is their process, but I think it's, your ability to say to them like, okay, I understand that we could look at everything, but we need to kind of focus it down. So let's talk about what's most important. Let's look at our primary endpoints, maybe our secondary, and then, go from there. And what's the most critical process like we were talking about before. I don't know if anyone.
Yeah, I agree with what Lynn has said, and Marianne and others. I think that the other piece that we have to think about is what's the program level risk, and we haven't talked too much about that, and what's the company level risk, right? So your lens would definitely be different versus the study level lens. So it's really important for the study level risk assessment to look at, like Lynn said, what's important to you at the phase of research that you're in, and also the size of your trial, the therapeutic area, and of course the primary endpoints. You kind of keep those in the back of your mind. That might be helpful.
Thank you so much. And we have a question in the chat, which Liz, I know you have some examples of common KRIs. You went through a couple. Do you have any others you could list out for us?
Gosh, we always want to know enrollment, right? That's a big trigger. So, just to rattle off, number of patients, what stage they're at, maybe percentage of patients who consented, patients that, the reasons that patient screen failed, and maybe putting a threshold around that. If you're further around in your research, and you know more about your molecule, we want to look at, of course, safety, not only the number of events, the type of events, but compliance with reporting those events. Oh gosh, what else, Lynn? Subject visit compliance, if you really wanted to get down to that level. Turnover at your site, that might be a risk to your study. Maybe it's not, would be another one. So there's just a few to get you started.
Yeah, and I think you want to talk about, like data management. Pretty common ones are, time to data entry. And again, how important is that for you? If you're not looking at something critical coming in, maybe it's, you make sure they're entering their adverse events on time, and you can live without the blood pressure or the, something else. So, sometimes you may have to even further define down just to make sure it's, again, telling you the data that you want. Rate of query being answered, a data management ones, lab ones or common ones is a sample getting to where it is on time, or is a sample good when it gets there? And that can indicate, a problem with your shipper being too slow, or it could be a processing problem at the site. So, again, think about, what it is there. But I'm trying to think of other things besides just, clinical ones that we can also look at commonly.
Yeah, the time it takes to distribute your product to your sites, or label your investigational product could be another one. To even you back up to make your drug product could impact your study as a risk. So
sometimes even amount of available drug supply and how you have to kind of distribute that is a huge risk that you have to manage.
Right. If you have a small drug supply, right, it becomes much more than,
Yeah, and if long lead times, it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
quick question here. Thank you, everyone. Rod, if I may just throw a question about inspection readiness and what actually, if in real life anybody passed the inspection recently, and what was actually requested and what was presented when it was a question of oversight of the study, of risk management. Anything that we discussed right now was part of the dialogue with the FDA, for example, or any other authority. Thank you.
I can share a quick example. December of, oh my gosh, when was that? I think 2020. I helped to run the back room of an inspection, and one of the key questions that this particular sponsor had to answer is monitoring oversight, and they didn't have an oversight plan. And so they had to sort of back up and try to demonstrate how they oversaw their CROs work, and they didn't have any KRIs to demonstrate that. So having that up front, well-defined, could have saved them some time in talking about it. And the regulator was interested in knowing how escalation of issues related to a site's non-compliance. So if we had maybe a KRI about maybe number of visits, and we saw a high number of monitoring visits happening at the site, why do we keep going back to the site to help them solve issues? Maybe we would have been able to detect that sooner and show. We didn't have that plan, so to speak, but we had all the visit reports to show. So it was a lot harder on the sponsor to pull all those plans to demonstrate that there was oversight, but it wasn't easy to detect it or pull it together. Does that help, Maria? I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just wanted probably, kind of summarize that in my experience, it was extremely helpful to have a governance charter, to have the KPIs, to have KRIs, and anything we touched upon today is very useful. I just wanted to ask if anybody has any particular experience. Thank you for sharing, Liz.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're almost out of time. One more minute left. Maybe one more verbal question. If not, I think we can go ahead and close this up, Maria. What do you
Yeah.
say?
I agree, Rod. Thank you to our panelists for such a wonderful discussion. We appreciate everyone joining. We will send along notes and takeaways from the session as well as the recording within the next couple of days. And have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thanks, Rod and
Thank you.
Hannah. That was really
Thank
good.
you, everyone.
Well done, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
all.